Hello and welcome to our 15th edition of FSI Fridays. I'm Johansson live in Charlotte, joined by Edwin in Boston. Happy Friday, Edwin. What's in store for us today?
Happy Friday, Johansson and everyone out there. Today, we're going to level set on the environmental, social, and corporate governance aspects of a company, what it is, why it's important, and the complexities behind it. Next, we'll talk about the ESG journey, perspectives from external analysis to internal values. Third, we'll talk about the intrinsic challenges and how Microsoft is helping address and solve those challenges. Then we'll wrap it up with Q&A today on FSI Fridays.
You said it, Edwin. I'm really excited for today's topic. For those of you that are watching live or on YouTube, as a quick reminder, we'll spend about 30 minutes on today's topic. We'll spend the next 10 minutes to 15 minutes talking about any burning questions that we may have. So please use the Q&A window and we'll monitor for questions during the presentation. If you're watching this recording on YouTube, feel free to use the comments below to ask your questions. So let's get started and meet today's presenter. So we are joined by Matt Sekol, who is a very prominent person in financial services and within capital markets here today. So Matt, do you want to just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So my name is Matt Sekol. I am a capital markets industry executive here at Microsoft. And really what my role is to look across all of capital markets. And for Microsoft, what that means is payments, hedge funds, asset wealth managers, data providers, private equity, fintechs, even a regulator's thrown in there. And it's about looking at the trends across the industry and trying to connect them to the technologies and services that Microsoft and its rich partner ecosystem can provide.
Matthew, I mean, that's pretty awesome. You're connecting a lot of pieces together. So I'm sure we're going to get deep into that today. And it's great to have you. So before we start, we see your office is full of awesome stuff. I specifically see Legos and a Snoopy poster. My kids and I could spend hours playing in that room. What's that about?
Yes, don't bring your kids over. I have kids of my own that try to get in on this. But I have lots of different Legos. I'm a giant nerd, as you can tell. I'm also really into Snoopy. And this Snoopy poster is one that's done by this guy named Tom Everhart. He's the only one that's licensed to paint Peanuts characters. And oh my gosh, in eBay's early days, I was looking for this print and I bid on it. I won it. And this was back when you had to email the person to kind of coordinate the shipping. So I sent this email out and the woman responded and said, this was my husband's. He really likes it. He just can't part with it. I know you want it. I hope you can forgive us. And I'm a pretty reasonable guy. So I said, you know what? I get it. I really like it. I'm disappointed, but I hope your husband enjoys it. So fast forward a couple months. And it's my birthday. I walk into my office and this exact print with the frame and everything is in my office. And I said to my wife, what happened? And she said, well, she really wanted to be the one that got it for me. She didn't want me going out and getting it for myself. And so she emailed this woman and said, hey, my husband just won this. Can you just tell him that he didn't win it and let me buy it for him? And she agreed to it. So my wife completely corrupted some strangers in order to give me a great gift.
That's an awesome story, Matt. So let's get right into the topic today. When we think about our financial services customers, we hear a lot about impact investing, social responsibility investing, and ESG. But today we're talking about ESG. So what are we really talking about?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when we think about impact investing and socially responsible investing, or SRI, these are really value-driven investing that happens based on your own personal values. Like, I think this company's doing something good that I agree with. I'm going to give my money and send them my investment. What ESG is it's a little bit different because it recognizes that there are financial benefits that can align through those values that company has. And what we see are these three pillars here. It's about environmental, social, and corporate governance. And if we unpack these a little bit more, the environmental pillar is really about sustainability, it's about energy, and it's about climate. Now, what's interesting is to think about the short-term views of how a company might progress over environmental versus the long-term view. There's obviously a lot of data around this. So if you think about a company's own energy portfolio or their water usage and the vast amount of historical and global data that's available around weather patterns and land usage and things like that, it can be wildly complex to deal with. So it's highly quantitative, but really complex. When we think about social is a little bit different. And of the three, I think social is the least mature, but also needs a lot of attention. So these are issues like social justice, which has gotten a lot of interest in 2020 specifically with the Black Lives Matter movement and the spotlight on that. But it's also about employee relations and things like COVID. How are you making sure that your employees are safe and taken care of? This one is a little bit more qualitative because when you're talking about diversity and inclusion initiatives, for example, you're talking about ways that people self-identify their gender or their race. And when you have a global purview, that can vary even region to region. What does it mean really to be a minority in a certain area of the world? And then how does HR figure out all that stuff, right? So this can be, to me, this is highly complex. But again, it's also qualitative. And the last one is corporate governance. And to me, this one is the most mature of the three. This one is the one that says, what does CEO pay look like? Are leaders being transparent? Do they support stakeholder and proxy votes? And all of this information is typically available through their quarterly and annual reports, through interviews that they do. And so this one has gotten a lot of attention with capital markets over the past few years, and it's very quantitative. But the other two have just come in really into the spotlight over, I'd say, the last 2 or 3 years. The way that Microsoft looks at it, this is really a data problem across all three.
Yeah, Matthew, tying all those pieces together and showing that it's important and how it impacts is super it's an amazing task, right? It's a big feat. And there's a lot of opinions that these three things don't matter. They're buzzwords, controversial topics. What do financial services organizations really need to think about when developing an ESG strategy? And what is the reality here?
Yeah, sure. So it's really about the ESG journey. And it's bringing purpose together with profits and how you can glean value out of the data. And many companies aren't sure where to start. So what ends up happening is you have like a chief sustainability officer, and they may be doing things that I consider to be table stakes, right? These are the sustainability initiatives around energy conservation and water conservation. But what's really interesting is where you get into materiality, because if you think about a capital markets firm may have a huge sprawling campus, and energy and water conservancy may help them save on operation costs, and it's the right thing to do. But if I'm a hotel chain, or if I'm a private equity firm and I'm investing in real estate, let's say, or even if I'm a cloud provider like Microsoft, doing something like retrofitting a building to be more energy efficient and water efficient is absolutely material to my bottom line and makes a huge impact. Think about some of the recent announcements Microsoft has made around sustainability. And not only that, again, I keep coming back to environmental because it gets a lot of attention, but also Microsoft's announcements around our diversity and inclusion initiatives and social justice and reskilling. All of these things are material to us and our supply chain as well. Now, really, when you think about this as a journey, what's past materiality is this idea of differentiation. And not a lot of companies have gotten to this place yet because it can be really complex and nuanced to figure this out. In his book, Grow the Pie, Alex Edmonds talks about a story a campaign that Patagonia had a few years ago called Don't Buy This Jacket. And Patagonia is very focused on sustainability as one of their core values. And so what they did was they said, you know what, don't buy a new jacket. We're going to explain to you how to repair your jacket because we want you to get more use out of it. This helps the environment. It turns out that approach, their customers loved it. And as a result, their sales grew 30%. So what turned out to be something that was aligned to their values, aligned to their customers' values, helped the environment, ended up driving more sales for them. So these are ways that companies can ESG represents an opportunity for companies to pull ahead of their competition. So table stakes kind of put you on a level playing field. Materiality helps you add value, but differentiating it around ESG really helps you pull ahead. And with inflows of capital into ESG of $50 billion in Q1 and $70 billion in Q2, this is definitely a challenge that not only companies need to figure out, but also the capital markets firms that invest in them.
Matthew, I mean, that's a very interesting point and some really, challenging stats there. So it sounds like capital markets firms have a unique perspective and opportunity. Now, while this topic of ESG applies to really all types of financial services organizations, how are capital markets firms in a unique position when it comes to ESG, and what's that perspective?
Yeah, I love thinking about this because it's fascinating, right? Capital markets firms are the only place where you find these two kind of sides of the same coin, where they have their own internal values. This is largely what we're talking about, right? This is, what are the table stakes? What is material? Do you have a lack of diversity and inclusion on your board? Are your buildings energy efficient? Do you invest in vice funds or offer vice indexes? And when you think about that last one specifically, it's about like what CVS did a couple years ago when they rebranded as CVS Health and stopped selling cigarettes. Like, it's how are you aligning internally to your values and what's out in the market? But then there's this other side, right? And this other side, not every industry has, but capital markets does. It's how are they looking across every industry and every company on the globe and saying, how is ESG impacting that company? And how am I doing that assessment? And this kind of sits outside of the chief sustainability officer. This sits with the board of directors and the chief investment officer and even the chief risk officer. It's the way by which firms are analyzing what these other companies are doing in the market around ESG and finding and picking apart that materiality and then making a decision whether or not to invest. It's really these two sides, like I said, of the same coin.
Matthew, that's a good point, right? So if we think about capital markets as a two-sided coin with these internal and external forces, what are some of the things that need to be considered across each? Can you walk us through their perspectives and what's important for that balance?
Absolutely. So if you think about the internal values, these are, again, what a chief sustainability officer and hopefully the board of directors would care about. And I say that because it really needs to be driven from the top down. And it's these things that you see here on the left. It's doing things like looking at your internal materiality, but also looking at things like smart buildings. Are you making the best use of lighting in those buildings, especially, with COVID and a lot of buildings are empty right now? Is there needless energy being used there? Is it things like wastewater management? Specifically with COVID, we're seeing a lot of interest in protecting employees from a heat detection and response perspective, but also contactless buildings. And one thing that I didn't quite add on here is building a talent pipeline. That kind of initiative can really drive value and differentiate you as a capital markets firm. Now, regarding the external analysis, you really need industry expertise to determine materiality across a set of industries. These pillars, the ESG, if materiality is considered, play directly into the risk of the investment. So while Microsoft looks at this largely as a data solution, capital markets firms really understand this as a risk. So we have our traditional risk factors that we use to analyze how a company might be performing, but ESG represents three new very important factors that I personally believe in 2 to 5 years will become part of those traditional factors. How can we understand a company's business through this lens? And if that company understands ESG really well, what does that mean about the leadership's understanding of their business? Does that mean that they could be more profitable in long term because they understand that risk? And this can lead to all sorts of new product offerings for capital markets firms. Carbon trading, carbon accounting. You can implement an internal carbon tax to fund sustainability initiatives, which is exactly what Microsoft does. And also you can do things like build bonds for companies around green, social, and other factors.
Yeah, Matthew, I mean, there's a lot of topics there, right? I think, what Microsoft is doing with sustainability and the efforts that we've committed to as a company, but we're also providing, a lot of other services that customers can take advantage of, our financial services ones. There's a lot of data underpinning both sides of this. You can think about smart buildings and IoT sensors to even things around kind of digital workplaces. What else could Microsoft kind of help here, help our financial services customers with as it relates to ESG?
Sure. So I think if I was a customer, this next slide is going to be the one that I would want to pause on and do a little bit of research, because I'm not going to go through everything because there's a lot here. But it depends again on what your role is. Are you looking internally or are you looking externally? So if we're the chief sustainability officer or the board and we're interested in kind of aligning our internal values to real initiatives, Microsoft has technologies and solutions to help. And one of the most interesting ones is the first one, the Microsoft Sustainability Calculator. If you think about what it takes to run a data center today and tie specific workloads back to energy usage, it's highly complex because there's a lot of virtualization, there's a lot of storage, there's a lot of networking. You're also doing things like purchasing energy from specific providers, which may or may not be clean. And getting to what your carbon emissions is for scope 1, 2, and 3 can be wildly complex. Versus if you moved your data center to the cloud, Microsoft has a sustainability calculator in preview that can just tell you that information and break it down by workloads for both Dynamics and Azure. So it's a really interesting way to get a different understanding of how your IT infrastructure is having a carbon impact. Now, some of the other things on here of note are IoT and Azure Digital Twin and mixed reality, all of which can help with smart buildings, but also can help planning things like return to office, which are critical for your employees. And there's a lot of solutions here like the Carbon Emissions Data Platform, as well as the Smart Water Navigator, which we've partnered with some of our partners to deliver that help customers understand things like, are they buying clean energy? How can they better purchase clean energy versus dirty energy? When can they adjust their systems to make sure that they're getting cost savings from energy and things like that, and doing all of this analysis? And one that specifically didn't make the list because it just came out this week, I think it's called Project Bronco, which is around that name is not right. I'm not getting the name right. But we just released a solution which is a low-code, no-code solution that integrates with a company's HVAC system that can basically say, I understand the weather patterns that are happening around my building, and I understand what it takes to heat and cool the building. I'm going to use that information and layer on artificial intelligence in a low-code way to get optimal energy efficiency. That was just announced this week, and in fact, I'll look up the name, but I can't remember what it is. Now, those are all internally facing. Now, if we think about the external, there's not really like an ESG SKU for this stuff. So what it's going to involve is it's going to involve likely these technologies in different ways, but it's going to involve a strategic partner or some sort of business consultant to help you get to the challenges that are specific to you. And it centers around things like data, artificial intelligence, machine learning, blockchain for supply chain management. If you're a private equity firm, and let's say you're dealing with a lot of privately held companies, their data is not public, so you might use something like natural language processing and Azure Search to come up with and identify dirty contracts that the prospective investment might have, right, and try to clean them up. One of the more interesting ones on here, though, is that confidential computing. And this is probably years away, but what confidential computing allows is you and a competitor to bring your data together in the cloud, analyze it through an encrypted way where it doesn't reveal to you what the other person has shared, but allows you to share the results. And I think there's a lot of potential there for capital markets firms to collaborate in a kind of a co-opetition way. I do think that it's likely a ways out, though, because of the heavy regulation and just the nature of financial services. But these are some of the technologies that we're talking about.
I mean, a lot of these things are fun to think about, forward thinking, the possibilities out there. You make it sound easy when you say we can solve technology problems such as using sustainability calculator, digital twins, leveraging cloud AI, machine learning models. We're always trying to make sure technology doesn't get in the way, and sharing this data isn't always easy, but it sounds like confidential computing has a lot of potential. What are the real challenges and opportunities that exist here?
Yeah, there are some very specific challenges, and again, you can kind of align these to internal, external, but really it covers the whole gamut. So the biggest challenge right now is that there's a lack of standards for reporting. So there's a lot of standards bodies like SASB, the Task Force for Climate Disclosures. There's a ton of them, but not every company is regulated in a way that forces them to adhere to them. And in fact, there's kind of a bifurcation between what we see in capital markets, where we see a ton of attention given to ESG in 2020, and we kind of see the US government backing off a little bit with the Department of Labor saying, well, ESG really doesn't reflect pecuniary measures, and we see the SEC making the case that maybe stakeholder voting isn't as important as it seems to be. Like we seem to have this bifurcation between the US government and what the markets are doing. So between the lack of standards, no regulation, confusion generally about whether or not ESG can have a fiduciary benefit, it's adding to the complexity of what's going on. So there are a lot of challenges in this space, but there's also a lot of opportunities for capital markets firms to step up and really analyze this in a unique way and develop new intellectual property. And whether or not that involves things like, again, big data, automating data pulls, and kind of automating manual processes, which a lot of this is based on right now. But really, all of this happens in the cloud. That's really where the opportunity for ESG happens. All of these things along the right here, they all happen in the cloud. And if you're on premises, you're really locked into what your capabilities are to unpack some of this ESG value. Ultimately, it's about data and risk. And the firms that figure this out, the firms that really nail this, will find an advantage in the market.
So Matt, the list of challenges look, fairly interesting here. I'd love to dive into some of this a little bit more. What does it mean by the opacity of ESG?
Yeah, so the opacity of ESG, this is something that I came up with as I was looking at the space and trying to rationalize ESG a little bit more. It's kind of like a cycle. So you have companies self-reporting, and they're doing this in a myriad of ways. They're carving out pieces of ESG and just reporting on those. They're using some sort of assessment tool to figure out everything, and they're either reporting the whole thing out or just reporting on pieces. And it really centers around that challenge on the lack of standards, right? They're trying to figure out how to get their messaging out to the market, but it's hard to compare it across different customer or different companies. And so we have this rise of data providers, which is great because data providers really understand the industries and really can cut through some of the greenwashing that happens, which greenwashing is where a firm kind of gives lip service to ESG but doesn't really do anything, right? So data providers can kind of unpack that, but a capital markets firm needs to understand whether or not that data provider are they transparent enough? Do they understand what that data provider is providing? And is there a level of transparency so that they can, one, either go right to the data provider and add value immediately, or two, whether or not they can use that to augment what they're doing or validate their own internal findings, right? So then we have both of these things feeding investors. So as a capital markets firm, I may choose to surface this information to investors, my internal analysts, right? And then they're making decisions and putting money where they think the ESG risk may make sense. And there's really three types of investors in this space. There's the impact investors, which are doing it because it aligns with their values. There's ones that understand ESG and believe that companies that understand risk in this way are better off. And then there's three investors who just don't care, right? And are using other traditional factors to do it. But regardless, as money comes in, then you see companies starting to adjust and find new ways to self-report. So it's really this big cycle around this opaque cycle. And To solve this challenge, you really have to get down to data governance and understand what data you're using to kind of surface these insights to the market, as well as your own internal analysts and your external customers as well. So it involves, again, things like the cloud, things like good data governance and artificial intelligence.
Yeah, there's a lot of factors here that is super important. Question from the audience, I'll read it straight up. Do we think ESG will become a mainstream consideration in business decision making? Part of procurement, scoring metrics, location and facilities decisions, partnerships, mergers, etc. So I guess the question is, do we feel it'll become mainstream?
I absolutely do. I'm super passionate about this space, which is why I think sometimes there's some confusion around impact investing in ESG, but really, when you think about traditional factors, they get you so far, but really this in our current world of climate change and the opportunities that may or may not exist across D&I, these values are ones that are going to really deliver actual value to companies going forward. And so it's going to be a factor in decision making. Now, do I think ESG is going to replace traditional factors? I don't see that happening, right? Because there is definitely value in those traditional factors. But if I'm an investment bank and I'm looking at mergers and acquisitions, ESG is a real risk factor, right? If I'm a private equity firm and I'm looking to make an investment in a private company, I probably want to understand the risk in their contracts that they have in their supply chain, because that can materially affect them. So I really think as time goes on, we're going to start hearing some of these use cases really come to light, and it's going to drive more and more people to do this. And again, we're seeing the US kind of lag a little bit behind the EU, but ultimately capital markets is a global game, and we're going to have to at least participate in that ecosystem in some way.
Well, thanks for addressing that, Matthew, because, passion of mine was CSR. That was another big thing back in the day, corporate social responsibility. And I didn't know anything about ESG before I met you. So I find it super fascinating, and I'd love to see where this goes over the next couple of years. So thanks for sharing that. And thanks for that person who asked the question. Feel free to continue using that Q&A panel. Let's go back into one of the other things that actually caught my eye on your slide was analysis over time. Can you double click a little into that topic?
Sure. Yeah, this one makes me crazy, and it's a pet peeve of mine because I think that there are natural progressions that need to be tracked more than the kind of quarterly and annual reporting that we do. And I think capital markets firms largely understand this, which is why we've integrated news sources into our investment analysis, right? Because you can't really use a point in time to determine the future value. Now, for both companies and capital markets firms, though, it's really difficult to figure out what's going on past that last quarterly or annual report, right? So it's because of that lack of standards. So they're only reporting on things in the past. And what companies need to do is figure out how to build dashboards and data pipelines that get them to the now view. And then where that differentiator that we talked about earlier, it was, you need to figure out the future. So think about, if I'm an investor and I'm looking to invest in energy, I might look at a utility company who understands weather patterns as well as land mapping of their data transmission lines and are using that to determine whether or not they might spark a forest fire in California. This is a huge problem, right? So isn't that understanding and their investment in that risk mitigation worth something to me as an investor? Well, it probably is, right? Because we know what happens on the back end of that. If they don't do that work, they end up getting fined. They could end up having lawsuits and things like that. So it's really about, like, we need to start getting to a point where we're at least understanding what we're doing now, but then getting forward as well.
So Matt, we spent a lot of time talking about ESG. Can you help our audience pull it all together, right? And how financial services organizations can help solve these challenges, and maybe how Microsoft can help with this?
Sure, absolutely. So Microsoft has this concept of a digital feedback loop. And I love this slide, so I adjusted it specifically to ESG. So this is the ESG digital feedback loop. And this is kind of the way we think about it. You have this internal data and research, and this is your own internal intellectual property, right? This is breaking down data silos and connecting data together potentially across different organizations to unlock its value, getting it into the cloud for example, and further augmenting what it's doing. It's taking a look at the external data sets that you're pulling in, whether it's through a paid data provider, social media, news sources, and figuring out, I know a lot of capital markets firms have data silos. Are we being efficient with our contracts? Are we bringing in the best external data we can and augmenting what we're doing internally with it? And then it's moving over to stakeholders and policy. What are the latest policies that impact this industry? What are stakeholders saying? Because they might identify a material need that we might have missed. And then it's layering on, again, this cloud and AI. And it could range from anything from the AI models you choose to the transparency and explainability, low code, no code, and letting analysts kind of play with the data on their own, through to the human validation. All of this kind of feeds each other. And I really like this because it's a simple way to think about what the long-term vision could be for your company to help understand ESG better.
ESG seems like a pretty complex challenge to tackle with many different perspectives. I can only imagine 20 years ago trying to do this without AI, machine learning, and tying all these data pieces together, even 50 years ago, right, manually. How does a customer get started today?
Yeah, so like I said, there is no ESG SKU for this. So it depends on what side of the house you sit on. And if you sit on the external facing side, but you're super passionate about this topic, I'd consider having your chief sustainability officer watch this, because there's a lot of solutions there on that internal side that we covered. So if you're chief sustainability officer, the things that you need to do are address the table stakes, right? You need to at least put yourself on level footing with your competitors. So we're talking largely here about sustainability and diversity and inclusion initiatives. So whether that's talent pipelines, smart buildings, whatever it is that you need to tackle, and Microsoft has solutions to help you get there across all of it. And if you're interested in those specific solutions, I really encourage you to rewind the video. The one that I couldn't mention, the low-code HVAC solution, is called Project Bonsai, and it just launched this week. So I really encourage you, as a chief sustainability officer, to look at it. Now, if you're on the external side, so board of directors, chief investment officer, chief risk officer, analyst, whatever. Really, this is it's not a huge lift, but I would encourage you to assess your data estate and review your external data providers. And then think about and prioritize what's important and come up with, I really want to solve for this. And come to Microsoft and ask us, and we can help you stand up data science proof of concept or pilot, as well as help you unpack that challenge a little bit more. And one thing I want to specifically call out is, as you know, if you've been watching FSI Fridays, we're really aligned to industry now. So when you reach out to your account team, they are your trusted advisor, not only for technology, but in this space. And you can have resources like me join the conversation to help you really unpack and prioritize your challenges. And some of the links here I just want to call out real quick are specifically some of the actions that I think Microsoft is taking around ESG specifically, if you're interested.
Thanks, Matt. We'll make sure to put these links in the comment window below or in the description of this when we post this YouTube video. I can't thank you enough for sharing your time and perspectives. I'm positive our viewers have learned a wealth of valuable information. I know I have, at least. So what we learned today is ESG is about data and analysis. ESG isn't just about doing what's right. There's potential for profits when you lead with purpose. We see Microsoft leading in this space with solutions that are both material to business and aligned to the ESG values, and we're a good partner in this space. If you're interested in starting the journey or in the middle of it and would like some guidance, feel free to reach out to your Microsoft account teams, and we can schedule a visiting session or a follow-up. So really great stuff here, Matt. Thank you again. Edwin, let's move to some Q&A. What are some of our viewers asking?
No, thanks, Johansson. And again, really good job, Matthew. Thanks for that insightful information. So we have a question here. Smaller firms don't have the capital to invest in ESG. So what do you recommend for them as a way to get started?
Yeah, so I've talked to a number of insurance and banking customers that have like investment arms. There's also smaller capital markets firms out there. If you're one of these, what I've seen, and this may or may not be you, is that you're a little bit on the early side of ESG. Breaking down your data silos internally, layering on intelligence from the cloud, and leveraging external data sets is a great way to get started, because especially those external data sets from data providers. And I won't name names here. I can get offline if anybody's interested on who they are. But they can absolutely help you get a leg up on your own internal analysis as well. And what hopefully they will do is give you a much stronger perspective aligned to some of these values that maybe your company has set, like sustainability and social justice.
Thanks, Matt. So we've got another question here. This one's coming from Anonymous. Looking across company data, there's lack of standards for reporting. How can an organization, organize around these lack of standards? Reporting on this isn't really regulated in the United States. While ESG and potential profits aren't really, governments aren't really pushing people in the way of official regulations or standards. Could you comment on that?
Sure. I think capital markets firms have a unique opportunity here to really wield their influence as a firm to help support policies and regulations. I know Microsoft does this. I believe we supported Washington State ran a carbon accounting initiative, and we're looking to have a more national conversation around carbon. Really wield your influence, if you have it, to influence those regulators and policymakers to create standards and have industries report out on those. It's definitely worth your time, because right now the struggle is we're getting data sets in from myriad sources in myriad factors, and there's a lot of cleanup work that needs to be done. And standardization of that will help tie direct ESG initiatives back to value. So I really encourage everybody out there to give that a try.
That's great, Matthew. Looks like we're out of time, and there are no other questions. So, thank you again for those watching via YouTube or watching live, asking questions. If you haven't already, be sure to register for FSI notifications and invites by visiting aka.ms/FSI Fridays. We're also open to constructive feedback, so you can send us your comments and suggestions at aka.ms/FSI feedback, or as well as YouTube. Be sure to catch recordings of our previous sessions on our YouTube channel at aka.ms/FSI Fridays recap, where you can also post any other follow-up questions there. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Joe Hansen, what an awesome lineup we have for the rest of October. Why don't you give the audience a preview of what's happening throughout the month?
Yeah, definitely, Edwin. I'm looking forward to the awesome topics that we have lined up for our outstanding October. Next week, October 9th, we're joined by Calvin Alvarez, who's going to discuss the benefits of those low-code solutions, something that Matt actually talked about, providing flexibility for financial organizations. Tyler Cooper, one of our top identity experts, is going to talk about how to do secure remote work on October 16th. On October 23rd, our workplace intelligent black belt, Conan Thomas, he's going to talk about how we can empower organizations to measure and drive change. And then last, on October 30th, one of the topics I'm really looking forward to, after some of our most recent announcements, we have our product managers lined up to talk about Surface, even including the Duo. So you won't want to miss this. And we'll see you next time on FSI Fridays. Thanks for joining.